Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today I decided to do something a little bit different with my channel. With this episode, you're actually going to learn a little bit about how I build commander decks, and particularly Purphoros, God of the Forge. I built different types of commander decks, and this one, as soon as I saw him, I decided that was going to be my monocolor red commander. I've had this deck for about a year, and it's actually at the point I've decided I kind of want to retire the deck. It's proved itself time and again that it does very well, plays very well in multiplayer or even in one-on-one. But the deck is sort of decked out as a multiplayer deck, and that's why I'm here right now, talking to you about it. So, Purphoros, God of the Forge, tlatotem, in command. I had to pull back the camera because I need lots and lots of room to do this deck, because commander decks tend to have a lot of cards in them. I mean, even with the lands, I have 21 mountains, and that's going to be one pile over to one side. But let's keep Purphoros over here and talk about what kind of cards work so well with him. I went with a token theme mostly because it's very easy to put out these kind of tokens. I have one of just about every Goblin token printed, and I keep adding more to the deck. Just keep these two because I keep playing so many of them. I actually have a card that makes Kobold tokens, but as far as I know, Kobold tokens don't exist, so this is actually one that I proxied out. It is not a foil, but I made it shiny. Why not? I have cards that produce 3/1 elementals, and I have cards that produce 1/1 elementals, and I'll have to find one that produces red cats, because apparently I have a card now that does that as well. So, to kind of keep with how things work, I'd like to show you how things branch off from Purphoros. I've got the Purphoros deck box right here. All the tokens, these tokens that I've shown you, fit into that very well. So, as having a decent commander, I needed a way to reproduce that effect just in case something happened to him. In this case, I went with 3 cards that, although they're not perfect, they work very well in the situations. First off was Impact Tremors, made from Dragons of Tarkir. Works very well as a Purphoros substitute if something were to happen to Purphoros, or if I could get both of them out, that's even better. Likewise, his ability, Purphoros, deals 2 damage whenever a creature comes into play. So I thought, although it's not doing it to more than one player, I can play Ogre Battle Driver. Whenever my creature comes into play, it gets +2/+0 and haste, meaning I can immediately swing out with it. Even Purphoros doesn't give my creatures haste, but that's a nice ability to do that. Speaking of being able to give my creatures haste, that extra little bit of damage goes a long way. So Urabrask is also another possibility. If something happens to Purphoros, having Urabrask out does very well. But this is, just kind of giving you an idea, because I've separated the deck out into what the cards do. Because Purphoros is a 6/5 indestructible for 3/1 red. Unless I have the red devotion, and unless there are 5 red mana symbols in the corners of all cards in play or more, he's not actually a creature. And his 2 damage that he deals is not commander damage. But it is worth noting that it's 2 damage to each opponent. So in a multiplayer match, you might be able to keep... you might have Purphoros out but not do anything, and people might look at you and say, well, that's not as big a threat because, you're playing mono red. Mono red kind of gets to float by a little bit because of that. So, these 3 cards that help when I can't get out Purphoros. But of course, to build any kind of a deck, you need as much mana as possible. And to do that, I actually built a deck with, there's 21 mountains in the deck, as you can see. And that really helps get the mana base started, because that's a little bit greater than 2/3 of the mana base, because I have other red mana producing lands, but these basic mountains are very necessary because I am playing cards that reference specifically mountains. We'll get into that when I get to the mana ramp part of this deck. But these are, of course, a very necessary part of any commander deck that is red. Then we get into our utility mana ramp cards like Temple of the False God, Forgotten Cave. Comes to play tapped, but you can cycle it later on in the game. That's always nice. Gitu Encampment does not come into play as a creature, but it is a creature that you can suddenly make into... It is a land you can turn into a 2/1 red creature with first strike. As a surprise, it works pretty well. Sometimes you'll have to wipe the board with cards in this deck, and then this is a nice way to get in that extra little bit of damage. Then we have extra abilities that get around something that every red deck is plagued by, and that is protection from red. Protection from red really just hurts this type of a deck. But of course, if you have a land that deals damage, lands are colorless. Even if they have red mana symbols, even if their color identity is red, it's actually a colorless source of damage. So, Keldon Megaliths, Hellbent, 1/1 red, tap, and it deals 1 damage to target creature or player. You can only use this ability if you have no cards in hand. But that ability gets around protection from red very nicely. Meanwhile, Keldon Necropolis, I assume this was from Invasion Cycle, this is from Future Sight. Keldon Necropolis taps for colorless mana, does not come into play tap like the Megalith does. But pay 4/1 red and tap to sacrifice a creature, and then it deals 2 damage to target creature or player. That's quite a bit of damage for a land to be able to do. And now, it doesn't sound like much. In fact, most players might pass this up, but when you're dealing with protection from red, God, every little bit helps. It's also important to note that whenever you have a land that has a tap ability, you should consider the cost of tapping the land as the mana cost as well. So where this says 1/1 red tap, I would count it as paying 3 mana to do it, because it's 3 lands tapped to get that effect. Likewise with Keldon Necropolis, it's 4 and itself. It's 4/1 red and itself, so that is 6 mana to deal 2 damage. Colorless damage, but that is 6 mana, and it's something that's really only useful later on in the game. But we'll keep that in mind, just as an extra part of the strategy. We also have Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle. Whenever a mountain comes into play, if you have at least 5 other mountains, you may have Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle, deal 3 damage to target creature or player. Also taps for red mana. But being able to deal 3 damage just by having the extra mountains in play is important for, obviously that's why we have 21 mountains and ways to search and get more mountains into play. So Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle, does very well for protection from protection against red. Also, Barbarian Ring is a 2-shot. I mean, it's only 2 mana. It's only 2 damage. It taps to put 1 red mana into your mana pool, but then it also deals 1 damage to you when you use it. Threshold, though, when you have 7 cards or more in your graveyard, you can pay 1 red and tap, sacrifice it to deal 2 damage to target creature or player. Sometimes this might be useful. You can respond to effects, or you can, just because it's a colorless source of damage, you can get around protection from red much more easily. Meanwhile, Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle, Barbarian Ring, Keldon Necropolis, and Keldon Megaliths, these can all strike together to deal quite a bit of damage if you can get them out. Now, we have other utility cards like Springjack Pasture and Care Keep. Care Keep and Springjack Pasture can both put out more creatures. Springjack Pasture doesn't come into play tap, taps for a colorless, then 4 and tap to put a 0/1 white goat creature into the battlefield. You can tap and sacrifice X goats to add X mana of any one color to your mana pool, and then you gain X life. Being able to gain life in Commander can mean the difference, but just being able to put out a creature and then use Purphoros' ability to ping everybody for 2 is really nice. With the Ogre Battle Driver or the Impact Tremors, that's just extra damage you can deal, and this is an uncounterable way to do it. Of course, they could Stifle or Trick Bind, but why? It's a land. They don't normally need to do that. Worth noting, though, it has to be 4 mana plus this, they have to have a minimum of 5 lands to do this. Meanwhile, with Care Keep, it just comes out. Doesn't even come into play tapped. It's a 1/1 red and tap. You put a 0/1 red Kobold creature token named Kobolds of Care Keep onto the battlefield, which is why we needed this token card. I have extras of these made just in case, and it's really nice when they come up. It's a very, very fun card. So we have creature production, and we have colorless sources of damage. So now that we've gotten mana, let's talk a little bit more about mana ramp. We've actually only shown you about 28 cards that produce mana as lands, but there are other lands in the deck. In particular, Thawing Glaciers is an old card from Alliance's block. It comes into play tapped, and then you can pay 1 and tap, search your library for basic land and put it into play. Doesn't count as your 1 land returned. And then shuffle your library. And then it says, at the beginning of the next end step, return Thawing Glaciers to owner's hand. This is an older card. It has not yet been errated or reprinted, as far as I can tell. I'm sure there's a new version of it from from the Vault sets. But it's important because at the beginning of the next end step, you can do this during your opponent's end step to put 1 into play, and then on your turn, untap it and use it again before it has to come back up to your hand. And that's a very, very nice ramp card. Getting this out on your first turn, untapping it on your next, and then waiting and putting out 2 lands in succession is very, very powerful, especially when it allows you to bounce back from an effect, or board wipe, or even land destruction. But we'll get more into that later on. We're still talking about our mana ramp cards. Of course, you have the ubiquitous cards like Soul Ring and Mana Vault. And then you have a little bit of the heavier cards. You can play things like, play Palladium Mirror. You can play Thran Dynamo. And those are all excellent colorless sources of mana. But we also have extra cards that double up on our mana ramp for red, or specifically going and getting the lands we need with Solemn Simulacrum, Explorer's Scope, or Wayfarer's Bauble. In fact, Explorer's Scope is such a nice card, you could play this in just about any deck. I'm surprised this did not replace Sol Ring, or at least works so well alongside of Sol Ring. You can put it out and attach it and then attack, and it allows you to filter the top cards of your library. If it's a land, you can just put it into play. It doesn't even have to be it doesn't hurt if it's non-basic or basic, which just improves your draw cards. It doesn't count as your one land return either. The effect is putting it into play. Then you have other forms of ramp like Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, Caged Sun, which is a very nice way to ramp up your mana. You put into play name red, and then any land that produces red mana gets more. Any creature of that color gets +1/+1, which is important because not all cards used to do that. In fact, Gauntlet of Might, which I realize is a very expensive old card, but I have it, so I'm putting it in the deck. All red creatures get +1/+1, and all mountains provide additional red mana when tapped. It's only 4 mana to get out, and that's one of the cards that makes it so expensive because it just gets out fast. You put it on your turn 2 with Mana Vault, or turn 2 with land, Sol Ring, and then another land. Speaking of other cards that are able to actually do better effect, perhaps, Mana Flare allows you to double up all mana. This includes your opponent's mana, but in a multiplayer game, it doesn't affect that much. Players who have abilities to draw extra cards will get the best benefit from it, but otherwise, you can wait and use it on a turn before you tap the rest of your lands. In fact, you can use artifacts to tap out the mana and then play this and then tap your lands for double mana. Always works very, very well that way. And lastly, although you don't consider him a ramp card, Kotha the Hammer. His ability to untap your mountain, which becomes a 4/4 creature, but you can tap it for mana first, then untap it and tap it for another mana. You can use this second roll as a -2 to add 1 red for each mountain you control, which doubles up very nicely. That's why we're playing so many mountains. He works very well in an all mono red deck. And then his -5 actually works against protection from red, because he allows all of your mountains have tap. This land deals 1 damage to target creature or player. That effect gets around protection from red very, very nicely. That's why these lands are excellent sources of ramp and sometimes help you to get around protection from. So let's keep these kind of in mind because we have our ramp abilities right there. Next up on the block, since we're using Purphoros, we needed a strategy where we put out a lot of creatures very, very quickly. And the best way to do that, well, everybody knows who Krenko is. Krenko is 2 and 2 red for a 3/3 creature. He has tap, put X red goblin creatures tokens onto the battlefield, where X is the number of goblins you control. Obviously, with him in play, you'd only put out 1, but as you start putting out more goblins, it gets more and more powerful. Specifically, we have in succession of mana cost, Mog War Marshal comes into play, has Echo of 1/1 red. You play him as a 1/1 creature, then next turn you pay the 1/1 red, or you sacrifice him. But his ability is whenever he enters the battlefield or dies, you put a 1/1 red goblin creature token onto the battlefield. Second up, we have Goblin Ravel Master. Other goblin creatures you control attack each turn if able, and then at the beginning of combat on your turn, you put a 1/1 red goblin creature token with haste onto the battlefield. Whenever Goblin Ravel Master attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking goblin. So, you can stack triggers with the attack effect, but you've got 2 cost to the 3 cost. Now for a 4 cost, we actually have Beetleback Chief. When it enters the battlefield, you put 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens onto the battlefield. So you're starting to notice a theme. This comes into play, it deals 2 damage for itself, 2 damage for the token. This comes into play, it deals 2 damage for itself, 2 damage for the token. But this comes into play, it deals 2 damage for itself, and then another 4 damage, 2 for each of the tokens. And it just gets more and more powerful from there, because Siege Gang Commander costs 5, 1 extra mana, and puts itself and 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens onto the battlefield. Also has the ability to sacrifice those tokens to deal 2 damage to target creature or player. So the synergy here is very, very real. You can use the effect of the sacrifice with Mog War Marshal, sacrificing it to deal 2 damage before your upkeep, and when it goes to the graveyard, you get another goblin token, dealing even more damage. Likewise, other effects that put out creatures in general. Rakamar puts out the 3/1 elemental creature tokens that I showed you earlier. And let's see, we also have Hordling Outburst as another additional way to put out tokens quickly. Kuldotha Rebirth works very, very well, even if it's worth it. I mean, you might sacrifice a Soul Ring just because it means 6 damage to your opponent. It's worth it. And also we have abilities like Firecat Blitz. For 2 red mana and X, you put X red cat creature tokens on the battlefield. They're all 1/1s with haste. You remove them from the game at end of turn. Has flashback of 2 red mana and sacrifice X mountains. You could balance it out by playing the effect, leaving 2 red mana left over, then paying 2 red mana and sacrificing the tokens. This would be a board wipe, except for players. Same with Tempt with Vengeance. I've actually blown this deck to other people to try it out, and with Tempt with Vengeance, you've been able to, because I was in the game, I decided, you know what, yeah, I'll take the extra tokens, and just because it would wipe everybody else out, because then they get twice as many tokens, and then Purphoros would deal twice as many damage, and they do it for like 5, and I say, sure, I'll take 5, and then they get 10 and deal 20 damage. Sure, why not? It happens. Then we have creature with a built-in recursion effect, and that's Grinning Ignis. It's 2/1 red for a 2/2 creature, but you can pay 1 red mana and return it to your hand. When you do this, it adds 2/1 red to your mana pool. You can only activate this ability whenever you can cast a sorcery, though. So, the reason why the Ignis works so well in this type of a deck is after he's already in play, he pays for himself to come back into play just by paying 1 red mana. So, for every 1 red mana you spend, pulling him up and then using the 2/1 red to cast him again, you can use that mana to, basically for 1 red mana, you're dealing 2 damage to each opponent. Because he keeps coming into play, coming back to your hand, and coming back into play, and Purphoros keeps triggering. Same with Impact Tremors, or, well, just in general, that's how that works. Grinning Ignis with any type of mana ramp or anything that doubles the amount of mana you have could mean game, because it's not a tap effect. You could actually play this for the original 2/1 red and then pay 1 red mana to return it back up and just keep going over and over again on the same turn. It's also very worthwhile to note that because of how Grinning Ignis works, if on a turn you needed 1 more devotion to red, you could cast Purphoros. And, I mean, you could cast it when you have Purphoros in play to give Purphoros devotion and a swing out, then just pay 1 red to return it back to your hand, and Purphoros is safe, because when Purphoros isn't a creature, it's very difficult to get rid of him. And that's why this deck plays the way it does. So we have a Goblin sub-theme, and a token theme in general, and it all works very, very well with this type of a deck. So we've talked about producing things to work with Purphoros, we've talked about our mana ramp, but let's talk a little bit more about our protection from red issues. This deck, because any monocolor deck has a lot of problems with protection from that color. That's why I've built up a little, if you could call it a little, I've built up 9 cards in the deck that work specifically to get around protection from red, and that doesn't even include the Keldon Megalith, Necropolis, Barbarian Ring, and Valakut, which work very well. In fact, Springjack Pasture puts out white goat tokens, so unless they're protection from red and from white, you still have a blocker, just in case. I know how prevalent the swords are in Commander. So let's talk about cards that get out. And this is technically a mana ramp. It's 3 mana, it taps for 1 colorless, but it's in the deck specifically to destroy target permanent. You can use it to get rid of protection from red cards. It gets around things that way very, very nicely. It also is technically a mana ramp type of card, but it works with other types of strategies. Meanwhile, Scuttlemutt can turn your creatures into other colors so that you can get around. It also taps for mana, which means it also works in a mana ramp type of strategy. Scuttlemutt's ability is tap at 1 mana of any color to mana pool. Not bad, 2/2 creature for 3. It's not a Palladium mirror, but it works very well. But then you have tap, target creature becomes the color or colors of your choice until end of turn. If you ever needed an effect, like if somebody tries to terror one of your creatures, tries to cast terror on Urboros, you can tap and turn Urboros black, which means terror wouldn't be able to get rid of it. Just in general, that effect works very well, and this will come up later on. I will bring this back out to show you another neat ability that works with this card. You also have things like Wormcoil Engine, which is just a solid life gain death touch. In Commander, being able to gain a little bit of life can mean the difference between win and loss. That's why it's in the deck. Ugin, the Spirit Dragon, has the ability to deal 3 damage to target creature or player, which can be enough to take care of any protection from card. It is not an artifact, which is also very important. It doesn't get around hexproof, but its ability does. You pay X and exile each permanent with a converted mana cost X or less. That's 1 or more colors. You can't get rid of an artifact that way, but you can get rid of any problematic protection from creatures other than Etched Champion. But as champion, you could just you could +2 and deal 3 damage to it. Shrine of Burning Rage. In this deck, because you're playing a lot of red cards, and the Grinning Ignis, for example, lets you keep pulling it up and playing red spells over and over again. So Shrine of Burning Rage can really work very well early, get it out, or even in the later game, even if you get it out. It puts a counter on during your upkeep, and then whenever you cast a spell, it gets another counter as well. It's 2 to get out, and then it's 3 in tap. You sacrifice it, and it deals damage equal to the number of charge counters on it to target creature or player. So this can build up quite nicely. I've actually seen people be able to get this out and kill off a Jin-Gitaxias, for example, because of the number of counters that get on it, and that works. Pyrite Spellbomb, only 2 damage, or you can use it early and draw a card. It's an excellent card in general, though. So it works in this deck very well. Let's see, Distorting Lens works much like Scuttlemutt. It turns a permanent just one color of your choice until end of turn. Very, very nice. Steel Hellkite, much like Ugin, allows you to get around permanents that have protection from red, because once it deals damage to an opponent, you can pay X and destroy all non-land permanents that have that converted mana cost. And of course, Ghostfire, much like the Pyrite Spellbomb or the Shrine of Burning Rage, is a colorless spell. Even though it's 2 in red, it says right on the card, Ghostfire is colorless, so it can target creatures with protection from red. So now that we've got this kind of worked out, and I've given you a little bit of an idea on what this deck can do for protection against red, I'm going to leave these 2 on top because we're going to come back to them. Now let's talk about how we keep the game running smooth. And that's with being able to draw cards. Now red's typical draw cards were Wheel of Fortune, Reforge the Soul, Wheel of Fate, but I find giving your opponent 4 turns to work it out is a little too much. If you want to do something, you got to do it now. Staff of Nin is another colorless source of damage, works very well against protection from red, but the ability to draw a card every turn is very nice. Meanwhile, Chandra Blaze, she's 6 mana for 5, or loyalty, but you can discard a card to deal 4 damage to our creature player. That's not what we're playing it for, though. We can -2 her, discard our hand, and then draw 3 cards. That's each player doing that. If you go against somebody who has suddenly figured out how to get out of Reliquary Tower and is holding 14 cards, you can use her -2 ability to get rid of most of their hand. And when you've got 1 or 2 lands in your hand, or if you definitely need something a little bit better, being able to sift it out to draw 3 cards is worthwhile. Same with Chandra Pyromaster. Her ability, she's 4 for 4 loyalty. Her 0 ability, exile a top card of your library, and you can play it this turn. That's really, really good. It's a type of ramp. Obviously, if you exile a top card and it's a land and you've already played your land, that land is lost. So you have to really think about what you're doing before you use Chandra's ability. Outpost Siege, much like Chandra Pyromaster's 0 ability, you can use the con effect to exile a top card, but it also combos well with sacrifice effects, because whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, Outpost Siege does 1 damage to target creature or player, which will make your opponent think twice before killing off all of your creatures. Then, as an extra ramp card, we have Sword of Fire and Ice. And it's not a ramp, not really a ramp as much as it is a card draw ability. This allows you to deal 2 damage to target creature or player, and by the way, that is a colorless source of damage, just like with the stack here, but it's also a card draw effect. Works very, very well. In fact, you could look at a Explorer Scope as being another card draw effect in this deck because of how that works. So, keep these things in mind because we're going to come back to them. I'll show you some more interesting things. Sword of Feast and Famine is just another utility card that we're going to come back to because it combos well with Hellkite Charger. In fact, if you were to put the 2 on and Hellkite Charger can get through, that's game. You could just keep attacking with it. It will, because of the Sword of Feast and Famine, always make them discard a card, and then you untap all your lands, which means you'll be able to pay off the activated ability of the Charger. 7 mana. This isn't a new type of combo. A lot of people have been playing this for a long time. But we can also use Sword of Feast and Famine with Aggravated Assault, because then it's only 5 mana to untap all your creatures, and then you get an effect. Which is interesting to note, because things like Scuttlemutt and Palladium Mirror tap for mana, so you can use the Aggravated Assault to untap your lands. You can also use Koth's ability to turn your land into a mountain, or turn your mountain into a creature, and even the creature land over here, Gitu Encampment, can be turned into a creature before this effect. If you are lucky enough to get out that combo, you'd have the Palladium Mirror, and you'd have, let's go ahead and just pull it out and I'll show it to you. Palladium Mirror, Scuttlemutt, Gitu Encampment, Koth's Mountain, and I think that's enough. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, that's your infinite combo right there. You can untap everything else you've got can attack, and then you just use the 5 mana from those 4 permanents to just keep swinging out. Just thought I'd point that out real quick. They also have ways to deal out double damage. Just a nice way to double the attacking effect with Flame Rush Rider. Lets you put out extra tokens. And then Dictate to the Twin Gods, you flash this on your opponent's turn just as an extra utility. Lets you get out even more damage dealt. Especially useful if you can untap and deal more damage. So between these 3 cards, you have double effect for your damage. Dictate works very well with Purphoros in general. You can flash it on the end of your opponent's turn. Flame Rush Rider works very well with Purphoros because you can dash it in for 2 damage, and then it will copy another creature that's attacking for another 2 damage, and you're getting damage from swinging it in. The deck has a lot of synergy that way.